Welcome to The Details with Adam Froer and Cecil Walker. This is a podcast where we examine the interaction between solution-focused brief therapy and current topics happening in the world. And we do this because we genuinely want the world to be a better place. So enjoy and come examine the details with us. So, Cecil, we recently went through an election cycle.
Still kind of going through it.
Since both of us are in Georgia, we're absolutely still going through it. We've moved to a special election for our Senate seat. But I think one of the things that would be worthwhile to talk about, and at least in this format, is lessons that we can learn from the election and how those lessons, not necessarily about politics or those kinds of things, but really about decision making. Oftentimes in our therapeutic work, people will come to us and say, I have a major decision that I need to make, or maybe not even a major decision, just a small decision. I just have two choices or more than two choices, and I have to make the decision that's the right decision. And sometimes people feel overwhelmed by that process, or they feel uncertain. They have kind of a desire to make sure that they choose the right decision, but they're not quite sure what that means or how to kind of reach that conclusion. And so I'm wondering if, as you think about the election and kind of choices that people have to make, what thoughts do you have about kind of parallels between those choices and just everyday decisions that people come to you and say, help me make these decisions?
Well, the first comparison is actually kind of a reflective difference between those, but maybe that also still informs this question that you're asking. A lot of times people seem very stuck when they come to therapy. Maybe they want some good that comes from multiple sides of the issue. They want this way, it has its pros, it has its benefits. They also want this side and it has its pros over here and its benefits. And I don't know if that's being in or out of a relationship, or taking a job, not taking a job, or confronting a family issue, not confronting a family issue, whatever it is. They see some good in multiple places and they are stuck because they want some of that good from either side. And I think we're seeing something very different in political issues these days, potentially because of what you're describing. I think I rarely come across people who are stuck. It feels like people are pretty sure of things that matter to them and how they make their decisions, politically at least. And I think maybe we see that in the divide that's happening, how a lot of people talk about the political division that's happening right now. And without going into it specifically, I think that that's partially why. It's like people have found a certainty based on certain issues, based on certain reasons, based on parts of their identity, based on things that they want for themselves, for their future, for their family's future, for the country's future. And so that difference, I think, shows us something that we might be able to look for in therapy as well, is when you know your why so well, it makes decisions feel more certain. It makes you feel like, well, of course I'm going to go with this. There's no way I could go with that. Or this thing is really, really important to me, so I have to go with this. I feel how much this is pulling me in this direction. And I think a lot of people felt that in this election cycle and maybe in recent election cycles in general. And I think you can tell that because if you were to announce your political affiliation or who you're voting for in any public space, you'd get a response of either, of course, or how could you, vote for that person, with everyone kind of falling where they fall with a lot of certainty. And so if we could pull some of that into therapy, I think you could actually see people dealing with decision-making a lot better if they found some of these similar things. I feel like if I walked up to anyone on the street and said, what are the political things that are important to you? What influences how you make a political decision, an election decision? They could list off 3 or 4 things probably relatively quickly, and things that are important to them and very passionate for them. But I don't know if they would have the same certainty if we said, what's the most important elements that decide how you take steps towards your own personal future, how you make big decisions in your own life. I'm sure lots of people could say some easy first things like my family or financial stability, but I think if you had to pull more out of them, it'd be kind of hard. So that's the first point that I think is worth mentioning, is just that finding certainty through what's important to me. What are the things that really guide, what I do and how I decide things.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful example. I think you're right. I think oftentimes political parties, they each have different platforms. They each have different things that they stand for on the issues. it's not difficult to see, where different candidates kind of emphasize different points and those kinds of things. And I think that does contribute to the why would I choose this particular candidate, or why do I affiliate with this particular party? And so I do think that you're right, discovering that why is important. When it's something like, a couple of those examples that you mentioned, should I stay with this relationship or should I leave this relationship? Should I buy a house? Should I not buy a house? How do people gather those same points of why? How often in political arenas, it's external features or factors, and they're the ones kind of feeding us information, and we either agree with it or disagree with it. But if I'm trying to decide if I should stay in a job or stay in a relationship or something, there isn't really external people unless I specifically go and say, hey, mom, or hey, partner, or whatever it is, can you help me walk through this process? So how do you gather the why if you're trying to make a big decision that's not a political decision?
I think this is an important question for people in general, but also for clinicians trying to help someone navigate this type of a scenario. It's still that knowing the why. That's pretty much the answer to the question, in short. But what that means is, if you thought about what it is you want out of coming from this decision, whether you buy the house or don't buy the house, you get to the other side, what do you want to have as a result of having made that decision? And whatever that thing is, that's something that is probably quite meaningful and important to you. And so you try to make the decision with that thing in mind, because that thing is what the target is. I could imagine someone saying, the whole purpose of me trying to decide whether or not to buy a house is to claim a sense of independence, or feel like, I've got my life on track. I'm doing the things I'm supposed to be doing as I grow and develop and move along in life. And I feel like when you zero in on those kinds of things, it makes the decision a lot easier. It suddenly becomes, well, of course I'm going to go ahead and buy the house if what I really care about is independence here. And I need to, even if it feels like it's a sacrifice, even if it feels like it's hard, it's going to come with lots of worries and stress. I know independence is important to me, so I'm going to go do that thing. When you can distill it down to what's important to you in the end, I think it becomes much easier to say, I'm willing to make a tough decision for that thing. I'm willing to put up with the extra stress that comes with that thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think as I was listening to you, I think oftentimes we think about the best approach to making decisions, and we make like a pro and con list, and we say, like, these are the positive outcomes that would come of that. These are the negative outcomes that would come of that. And I think that can be really a useful thing. But I think there's another layer in what you said when you were kind of highlighting that idea of independence, right? I think that gets to a deeper level of, if I buy this house or if I stay in this relationship, these are the possible outcomes. These are the impact that would have on my life. But there's also a level that we could go to that would say, in essence, what would it mean about me as a person if I make that kind of a decision, right? So if I go with the example of buying a house, that means that, like you mentioned, it means that I have some sense of independence. I get to decide what my house looks like. I get to decide how it's decorated. I get to, but it also means potentially that I'm a contributor to society, that now I'm paying property taxes, that I'm helping the local schools as a result of that. And so thinking about what kind of person do I want to be, that could then also influence. Do I want to be a person who feels steady and grounded, and therefore I'm going to stay in this place? Or am I a person who feels like independence actually is the opposite of that? It's not being tied to one particular place, but it's being able to go out and travel. And so I think what independence means might actually lead to a different outcome, but that's linked to the kind of person that I am, or what it would mean about me. And so I think going that one level deeper on what kind of person am I, or what kind of person do I want to be, that can also then impact decisions that people make.
Yeah, I definitely see you're making this a dimensional thing where it's not just finding a why, but it's kind of even going layers beneath that into some extrapolations of those whys. How does that why, grow inside of you and say something about who you are? And even your answer to that why, what is your version of that thing? Independence could mean many different things to different people, and could make someone a different kind of person depending on who's handling that independence. So do you suggest people stop and ask themselves these kinds of questions? Or do you think this is something that's reserved for therapy? That's where you go and you extrapolate these things.
I think both could be useful and beneficial. I don't think that necessarily you have to go to therapy in order to investigate those questions. I think it's one way that you could investigate those questions. I think sometimes therapists, I think, are trained to kind of help you to think about those existential issues and to think about, like, the bigger meanings of the things that you do. And so I think possibility, but I think one of the things that you could easily do that on your own, right? We just went through a series of questions of what kind of a person do I want to be? What would it mean about me if I chose this outcome? And so I think somebody who's really well-intentioned, somebody who's dedicated to kind of self-examination and assessment, they could do that on their own. It might be helpful just to hear somebody else ask you those questions. So I think that could happen either way. But I think as far as solution-focused therapy goes, one of the things that I think is really meaningful about solution-focused therapy in decision-making is that it really is focused on the outcome. So it doesn't go back and investigate, like, when have you made poor decisions before and what contributed to can you overcome those, right? So there's no meaning making of past. In some sense, it says, if you were to think about the best version of you or the version of you that you want to be, what kinds of decisions would be in line with that version of you? And so I think that is one of the inherent differences. And so I think if you're doing this by yourself, you could easily fall into all of that regular self-talk that you have. Potentially, you could say, like, I'm not a very good decision maker, or I don't know how to make these kinds of decisions, or what if I make the wrong decision? Or having somebody else who kind of is in charge of holding on to, this isn't all about an outcome, a desired outcome place, that can kind of help you be grounded throughout the decision-making process. So I think that's one key that might be really useful throughout that process.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If I can squeeze it in, I think I have one more question for you along this line. I don't think I've ever actually heard you describe what happens next, since we're always so focused on what's happening in therapy. But what does someone do with the decision after you've made it? I've defined who I am. I've chosen the route that I'm going to go. But most of the time, people have to keep living with the decision, right? Like, that nexus point has follow-up constantly beyond it. So what does someone do with that after that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it actually reminds me of, going back to where we began, these political decisions. You're absolutely right. We, on election day, we make a decision, but then for at least 2 years and sometimes 4 years and sometimes longer than that, we have to live with the decisions that we've made. And so I think that one of the things and again, kind of taking this from a solution-focused perspective, is one of the things that is really useful throughout that process is to begin to look for confirmations that you've made the decision that's good for you, right? And again, perhaps that comes from this pros and cons list, paying attention to when the pros show up, trying to put things in place to minimize the effect of the cons, right? So I think that going into it with a well thought out assessment, that can help prepare us to say, I'm going to be on the lookout for when I am confirmed this was the right decision, but I'm also going to now compensate. I know that there are these potential pitfalls, so I'll put things in place. Maybe one of the cons was, maybe I'll use a different example than a house. Maybe it's a relationship, right? Maybe one of the cons of staying in this relationship was, well, we always tend to argue about such and such a thing. So then knowing that up front, and then maybe that means we go to therapy to talk about that specific thing, or maybe we come to an agreement and say, when we argue about this, what's a good way for us to resolve this? Or where can we compromise so that this becomes less of an issue over time? So going into it, I know that's one of the potential pitfalls, so then I can put energy and effort into compensating for that. I think that's one thing, looking for the pros, looking for, evidence that this was the right decision, compensating for the pitfalls. But I think as well is to continually reassess, again, kind of going to that deeper level of meaning making. What does it mean about me? What kind of person am I if I make this kind of a decision? And I think reminding yourself that you are that kind of a person. I think looking for other decisions that you can make, because now you know I am this kind of a person. So what other decisions are in line with being this kind of a person? So I don't think you have to make one decision and then stay static. It's almost like that personal development, that personal growth to say, so since I'm this version of myself, since I'm this kind of a person, what other things do I need to do to continue to be that kind of a person?
Yeah, I like that. It's almost compounding on itself. It's continuing to choose the kind of person that you're trying to be and having to do the things that kind of a person, even if your choice doesn't change over time.
Yeah, and I think it's almost like, I guess the word as you were talking that came to my mind is like living on purpose, like not just letting life happen to you, but deliberately saying, okay, if this is my why, or if this is the kind of person I am, what do I need to do as a result of that? So I'm purposefully impacting life instead of letting life just impact me.
I feel like that's always going to feel more meaningful than life just happens to happen to you. So whether or not you've made decisions that you're happy with, whether or not you're in the place where you specifically want to be, if you're doing things on purpose, I think that's always going to be a significant experience. That's always going to feel like you're moving towards something.
Yeah, and I, again, hearkening back to kind of politics, right? If I'm a person who just chooses not to vote, then as life happens, as policies come and go and those kinds of things, it's not very meaningful to me. Whereas if I am an active participant in that process, and let's say the candidate that I choose that I particularly like, they start putting policies in place, those policies or those changes or those become meaningful to me. They become kind of landmarks of like, this is useful. If, on the other hand, the candidate that I don't particularly like, or I didn't choose, if they're the ones, then that can also then feed into, now I'm going to act purposefully, right? Now, perhaps I need to get more involved, or perhaps I need to educate other people so that they vote the same way that I vote. Or so it could, just being involved makes the impact of that decision a more meaningful impact. And therefore it continues to influence decisions that I make going forward.
Yeah, I think what this conversation has illustrated is that decision-making goes well beyond, I don't think there's anything specifically wrong with the pros and cons list, but when you look at all of the facets that we just described, that seems so one-dimensional. And there's something much more personal, much more meaningful, has much more depth to it that you can start to explore to make your decisions.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it really comes down to, and this is a very solution-focused concept of like, what version of you do you want to be? And if I make decisions based on my desired version, that's, like you said, it's much, much more meaningful than just like, what would I get as a result of making this decision? It's more about like, what can I accomplish, or what does it say, or how can I contribute if I make this kind of a decision?
And that now makes this decision fall as just a plot point along a narrative of you becoming or being the kind of person that you want to be. And that just feels so much bigger than, two-dimensional, do I do this, do I don't do this type of thing. Yeah,
really good points. Well, thank you for engaging in this conversation. I hope it was useful for the people listening. We'd love to hear kind of thoughts and feedback about that process.
This podcast is sponsored by the Solution Focused Universe, a global community dedicated to the growth of professionals who want to master the solution-focused approach. The SFU is home to the world's largest library of solution-focused material, which is updated on a monthly basis. Join fellow community members and solution-focused leaders in coaching calls and private Facebook groups to discuss anything and everything related to solution-focused brief therapy.